I let my viewers choose the books I need to read for 1 whole year. Basically, for 1 year, my viewers have been able to put book forwards that they want me to read, and then I've randomly chosen one book, and then I have read that book, and I've invited my viewers to read that book with me if they want to. Now, this has been a crazy experience with loads of ups and downs, and also if you want to learn how you can put a book forward, then I will reveal a bit more about that later on. But yes, for 1 whole year, my viewers have forced me to read one book of their choice, and this was my experience. Month 1. There were several books that were put forward, and the book that was randomly chosen was Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. Now, if I'm being absolutely honest, I wasn't overly excited by the prospect of reading this book because a lot of people described this as like a fun, swashbuckling adventure. And while I was very excited about this new experiment I was now trialing, reading books out of my comfort zones and basically putting my destiny and my TBR out of my hands, I wasn't overly excited about this one because this basically sounds like a book that I would hate, and I read it and I ended up giving it 2 stars. Now, I recently met Nicholas Eames, the author of this book, at Worldcon, and he was the loveliest human being I've ever met, and he had seen my review. I literally posted a review to my channel where I kind of discussed that I didn't really get the hype for this book. He was so gracious. He really appreciated me reading this book with my viewers and just trying something that was a bit out of my comfort zone. Now, what I'll say is that if you like humor, swashbuckling, and just the concept of a crew coming together to go on a quest, and definitely has like D&D vibes, and this novel is definitely for you. Like, I know it's super popular, like Patrick Leah loves it, Daniel Green, he absolutely loved this book. But yeah, month 1, not a great start for letting my viewers choose my books. Month 2, the book that was randomly put forward that I had to read is City of Brass. Now, I was actually quite excited when this novel was randomly put forward because I had heard so many incredible things about the Deva trilogy. Is that how you pronounce it? And yeah, Shannon Chakraborty is just one of those authors that is massively popular but has never really been on my radar as an author that I desperately need to read. So it's actually quite nice to be forced to read something that was a bit out of my comfort zone. Now, if you know nothing about this trilogy, then it's actually like a historical fantasy because it takes place on Earth, but it does have some fantastical elements to it. And it's set like in a Middle Eastern kind of world, which I just loved. I felt like the world building was incredibly original, and there were some really great characters in this novel. Now, my primary issue with this novel here was that I found a lot of the politics to be a bit confusing, and I'm a huge fan of politics, and there are quite a lot of like romancy love elements in this novel. I don't really think that there were so many elements in this novel that were badly executed by any means. I just didn't really expect to love this novel, and ultimately I ended up giving this novel 3 stars. Not a really great start to this experiment. Let's get to month 3. But before I reveal that, you might be wondering how you can be one of the viewers that is able to put books forward that goes into this random pot that I once a month choose a book from. If you join my Patreon on tier 3 or 4, then you either get 1 or 2 ways you can put books forward, and then once a month I randomly choose a book from that pot, and then I read it. But the cool thing about this is that I actually allow my patrons to read the book with me. So I have a Viking Book Club where throughout the month we actually discuss this book on the Patreon chats, and then at the start of the next month we actually have a Zoom book club discussion where we hang out and talk about the book. But without further ado, for month 3, I randomly had to read The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams. Wow. Now, if you've been watching my channel for the past 6 to 8 months, then you know that I have fallen in love with the series, and even though I haven't read the 3rd book yet, because that book is massive, genuinely, this has become one of my all-time favorite series. It is so beautifully written, it is classic epic fantasy, but man, Tad Williams' writing style is to die for. And also, fun fact, did you know that George R.R. Martin was massively inspired by Memory, Sword and Thorn? You can see so many clear inspirations from that novel in Game of Thrones. It is mad. But yeah, this is like proper incredible epic fantasy with incredible politics, fascinating world building, and it's just a beautiful slow burn. Yes, this novel takes its time to get to its place, but when you finally get to the climax, the whole journey has definitely been worth it. Absolutely love it, and I can't wait to actually wrap up the series, hopefully this year. But before we go to month 4, I need to tell you about a book that someone could put forward to get me to read, which is Cineworld Chronicles by Ray Bowen, today's sponsor. Now, if you're looking for a book that is described as Ready Player One meets Good Place, then this is the book for you. Now, Cineworld is set in a fantastical setting where karma is currency and every form of paradise exists, or at least could exist, at a price. Now, for example, kindness can buy you a castle, and being virtuous is really being rewarded. Now, this novel follows Brims as he struggles to redeem his soul, and Sarah, a character willing to go to extreme lengths to take destiny into her own hands. Also, I have to say, how cute is this chicken on the cover? I am tempted to pick up this novel just so I can meet this adorable pet. I love this pet so much. So, if you're looking for a dark fantasy tale that focuses on elements such as life,
death, magic, mystery, love, and loss, then this is the novel for you. Now, while I haven't read this novel, this sounds like a perfect palate cleanser if you're an avid fantasy reader like me. So if you want to check out Cinema Chronicles, or potentially even put this book forward for nominations for the Viking Book Club, then I'll leave a link in the description down below where you can go and grab yourself a copy. Thank you so much to Ray Bowen for sponsoring this video.
And for month 4, I randomly chose Delight in Death by Dennis Schramer, who was also a patron of mine, and he put his own book forward and I randomly chose that book. I'll just keep this brief here. If you enjoy humor, swashbuckling, absurdism, again, you'll probably love this novel. But for me, it just didn't really work. Now, this novel is quite short, and there were some moments that I quite enjoyed, but as a whole, this just wasn't really for me. Which means that this experiment, for the first 4 months, I've only really loved one novel. Not that great. Now we come to month 5, and the book that was randomly chosen was Fairy Tale by Stephen King. I've heard mixed things about Fairy Tale. This was like described as an epic fantasy, or like at least a fantastical novel. And just the title, Fairy Tale, Stephen King, come on, what more can you ask for? Genuinely, the first 200 pages were some of the best Stephen King writing I had ever read. I loved it so much. I was absolutely addicted and immersed in the first half of this novel. We genuinely see Stephen King from the best side here. Beautiful coming of age story about this young boy that becomes friends with this old man, and there's like a dog there. I mean, who doesn't love a dog? And yeah, this was just peak Stephen King storytelling. And then around halfway through, there is a big twist, and suddenly the coming of age story is done, and we now just have a totally generic fantasy story. Oh, the second half was one of the worst things I read by Stephen King. It genuinely felt like Stephen King wrote 2 almost separate stories and combined them, and you got the mess that was Fairy Tale. First half, incredible. Second half, absolutely rubbish. I'm still glad I read it, but yeah, I wouldn't really recommend Fairy Tale to anyone except if you're a massive Stephen King fan. Let's go to next month. For month 6, the book that was randomly picked is The Return of the Knights by Gregory Contaxis. Here we have it. Now, Gregory is actually one of my patrons, and he's the author of that novel, which was interesting because obviously I hugely appreciate the support Gregory is giving to my patron and so on, but I also needed to be very honest about my reading experience. Ultimately, while I found a lot of the aspects in this novel to be very fascinating, for example, the world building that we're set in has some Greek inspiration, which I'm not sure if I read that many fantasy novels that has like Greek inspiration to it, and it also has a lot of the elements that I love in fantasy, like a coming of age, a lot of politics, a lot of big battles and so on. And while I was reading it, I wasn't really sure why. I just didn't feel overly connected with the characters. I think it might just have been one of those novels that I maybe read at the wrong time. But nonetheless, I'm glad I read it, and I think I gave it 3 stars. For month 7, I had to randomly read Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Oh, again, I'm so glad that I did this experiment because my viewers have actually forced me to read some incredible books. This novel has become one of my all-time favorite novels. And you know what's so interesting? This is a sci-fi, a genre I genuinely really struggle with. First and foremost, what makes this novel incredible is that while it has so many fascinating sci-fi concepts, the main driver behind this novel is really the characters. Incredible characters. Now, the overall concept is that we're basically on a spaceship where there are, I think, 6 or 7 characters, and they all know that they are somehow connected, but they're not sure how. So they basically go in a circle and they tell their story of why they're heading to Hyperion, this planet. This first novel, Hyperion, kinda reads like an anthology with like 6 or 7 short stories, and all the stories are either absolutely phenomenal, like masterpieces, or very good. Another thing I have to mention is that Dan Simmons, he must be a prophet because he predicted so many things about AI which has come true. And this novel was written like in the late 80s or something. Out of all the books I read in the 12 past month, Hyperion is without a doubt the best one. Okay, we now come to month 8, and the book that was randomly forward that I had to read was Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. Now, I was so hyped when this was actually chosen for several different reasons. Firstly, so many people compare Evan Winter to John Gwynne, who is one of my all-time favorite authors. Secondly, this is an African-inspired epic fantasy, and if I'm being absolutely honest, I haven't read many African-inspired fantasy novels, so this was just super exciting. While I actually did enjoy it as a whole, and I'm glad I read it. Maybe my expectations were just a bit too high. I expected to absolutely adore this novel, and ultimately I think I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. Now what I loved was the world building. I thought our protagonist was a very interesting character, and yeah, there was a lot of actions, a lot of training sequences, and the overarching plot was great. Now my biggest issue with this novel was that there was just too much focus on the training sequences, and that I just found the protagonist to be too focused on revenge. I understand that you can be angry for years and years and years, but the intensity of the hatred and anger of our protagonist almost didn't make any sense. I just wish there was something else to this novel than just this intense focus on revenge. So yeah, ultimately I ended up feeling a bit deflated by my reading experience just because I just didn't feel like I could fully relate to our protagonist. I'm glad I read it, and I might still continue this series one day. We'll see. Okay, but for month 9, I actually read again a book that became one of my new favorites of all time,
which is Needful Things by Stephen King.
This novel was so good. Now I think I read around 20 Stephen King novels at this point, and a lot of people will always mention like It or The Stand or Pet Sematary or Mystery, but I'm not really sure why Needful Things isn't mentioned more often as one of the all-time greats when it comes to Stephen King. While it does maybe have some pacing issues in places, as a whole I was utterly captivated by the story. It has an incredible villain, and just the overall concept of a random mysterious guy coming to a small town, opening up a shop where people can come in and get a wish or something that their hearts desire, but then it comes at a great cost. Just that concept is so brilliant. But I think overall just the plotting in this novel was so good. I don't want to spoil it, but there's one scene at around page 300 which has become one of my all-time favorite Stephen King plots. There are so many moving parts, and Stephen King is just able to bring so many elements together that just leads to this absolutely insane climax. I can't even describe how I felt when I actually read that scene. It was just so crazy. Genuinely, I went into this novel expecting maybe to enjoy it quite a lot, but I didn't have that high hopes since I don't hear people that often talk about Needful Things. But yeah, it's not my all-time favorite Stephen King novel, but it's genuinely become one of my all-time favorites, and I think way more people need to recognize and acknowledge that this novel deserves more hype and praise. It was so good. Okay, month 10, and the book that was randomly put forward was
Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Alright, I've heard amazing things about this.
I was so excited when this was chosen. Firstly, because this is an absolute classic, and secondly, I've heard that Octavia Butler is one of the most talented authors ever to have been in the fantasy genre, so I was super excited. So this was an interesting reading experience for several reasons. Firstly, this is like a dystopian futuristic novel that was written in the 90s, and in the very first page this novel opens up stating that we are in June 2024, which is literally like 2 months ago, and I read this book like 3 weeks before it was supposed to take place, which is just mad. Secondly, what I just really loved about this novel was that Octavia Butler hadn't gone too crazy with predicting what the future would be like. There are no flying cars or like space travel, there are no aliens. The future she expected is not that far off. I mean, it's definitely a bit bleaker, a bit darker what she predicted, but I'm just very impressed that she actually stayed quite realistic and was quite good at actually prophesying what the future would be like. Now, this novel was very bleak, and this novel is kind of written in a stream of consciousness kind of writing, where just every single like chapter, or even within the chapters, you just go from one horrible event to the next horrible event to the next horrible event to the next horrible event. It was just so depressing. I really struggled to even finish this novel because there was like almost no hope. There's no characters I really rooted for or felt for. But the interesting thing is that when I finished this novel, it kept staying with me. There's so many interesting themes about like identity, religion especially, and just critique of governments and capitalism, and so many interesting things that while I didn't really enjoy my reading experience with this novel, I ended up being so glad that I actually had read it. So yeah, Parable of the Sower, I'm glad my viewers forced me to read it, but I wouldn't really recommend anyone reading this novel, unless if you're looking for something thought-provoking or bleak. And then we came to month 11, and the book that was randomly put forward and chosen was A Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. The Lacanius trilogy has been on my TBR for such a long time, and I just haven't gotten around to reading it. And my viewers finally forced me to read it, and I'm so glad I did. Now, a lot of people say that this novel is very reminiscent of The Wheel of Time, and I totally agree. It has a lot of clear inspirations, but it feels a bit more modern, like the writing style is a bit more accessible. There's so many different things, I'm not going to go into all of them. Now, while The Wheel of Time is like a 14 or 15 book series if you count the prequel, this is a trilogy, and you can definitely feel like the scope is massive. So when you read the first book, it's quite an accessible kind of epic modern fantasy, but I've just finished book 2 actually recently, and the complexity has definitely increased a lot, but I've also really enjoyed book 2. So yeah, this was a very, very good recommendation. I'm really glad I read it, and I can't wait to actually read the third book. So viewers, thank you so much for forcing me to read this one. Okay, month 12, and we finally come to the end of this whole year. And as you can see, there's been a lot of highs and a lot of lows, and unfortunately, this experiment kind of finished on a very low. The Captain by Will White. Okay, very interesting. So if you watch my channel, then you know that I've struggled a lot with Will White. I read the first book in the cradle. Yeah, basically, while I did enjoy my time a bit for the first 100 pages or so, this novel is just absolutely chaotic, loads of like fun, absurdism, swashbuckling. So I'm just saying, if you're a big fan of like Kings of the Wild or Discworld or The Black Tongue Thief, like novels that are just absolutely chaotic, fun and absurd and have lots of humor, you'll probably love this novel. I mean, it has incredibly impressive rating on Goodreads, and after page 150, it just became too much. It was just like every single sentence is just a massive joke or just some, like so many absurd things happen in this novel. I think this might be the lowest rated novel I read since I launched my book club, but yeah, at least I read something a bit out of my comfort zone. Okay, so it's been 1 full year, 12 books that my viewers have forced me to read. Now, while I think most of the books, if I just think about an average, I probably haven't loved, I have found some absolute bangers. And I suppose the obvious question is, would I do this again? Yes, absolutely, for 2 reasons. Firstly, my favorite thing about this whole thing hasn't really been reading these novels, but it has been connecting with my patrons and having a book club. I never expected to have a book club. And just to be able to discuss a book with people on a monthly basis and then just hang out with them has become one of my favorite things I've ever done since I created this channel. Secondly, I've learned a lot about my reading taste. Reading books that are outside of your comfort zone or reading books that you might not end up loving, it can be a good experience. I felt I've become more and more confident in not picking up some books because now I can actually say, well, I have actually read books that are similar or people compare them to these kinds of books. So yes, I'm going to continue to let my viewers put books forward, and then I'll just randomly choose one every month. And if I hate it, so be it. And if I love it, fantastic. But what do you think about allowing other people to choose books that you have to read? Is that something you would ever do? I would love to hear your thoughts. And thank you so much for watching. Oh, you're still here and you want more? Well, the good news is that I have a Viking Book Club on my Patreon. If you join my Patreon, then you get access to an exclusive book club where every single month we read one book together and the book can be put forward by you. If you join tier 3 or 4, then you can put a book forward and then I randomly choose a book from the pot that we end up reading together, and throughout the month we discuss the book on the Patreon chats, and then we also have Zoom hangouts, which honestly are some of my favorite times of the month. This month we're reading this book, and next month we're gonna be reading this book. Also, since I launched my Patreon, I basically spent my money back into the channel on video editing. I've had more than 40 videos professionally edited, so if you want to support what I do here and also help me upload more consistently, then I'll leave a link in the description down below.